What's up, YouTube? Well-rested Piper here. Smoking some Cornell and Deal, small batch, Sun Bear Black Locust. I managed to get one tin because I wasn't sure if I was going to like it or not, because I don't typically smoke many cased or aromatic blends. Diving into blends like this is a newer thing for me in the hobby, but I am enjoying it, so I guess it's a little bit of a bummer that I didn't get more than one tin, but it's not a big deal. And so today I figured I'd talk to you about other things that I do besides smoking a pipe. So, um, and I guess tobacco in general. I like to research and read about tobacco, all tobacco, including cigarettes, nasal snuff, chewing tobacco, cigarettes, everything. It doesn't matter. But I predominantly use pipes and cigars. I don't really care for the other types of tobacco for my own personal use. Though I would like to try nasal snuff. I just find it difficult to get here. But outside of those hobbies, I also like to read, and I read a lot of fiction. And I've been diving back into that recently. And I just reread the majority of Brandon Sanderson's The Stormlight Archive because there's a new entry into that series coming out in December. And going through that just made me realize how we as people can get so absorbed into something fictional that it's really easy to forget that what you're reading isn't happening sometimes. Even in the realm of science fiction and fantasy, you get so attached to some of these characters that it really just destroys you when something bad happens to them. And then outside of reading, I ride motorcycles. I have two bikes in my garage, and I don't do that as often as I would like to, but I do spend time doing it. But I guess the majority of what I wanted to talk to you today about is the reading. So uh, it's starting to come up near autumn here in the States, and that means that a lot of the stores and places are starting to put out all their Halloween decorations, all the spooky stuff. And so, because of that, I decided to get a book from my library. I can't remember who the name of the author is right now, but the title of the book is something like "There's Someone Inside Your House." And what it is it's a teen slasher, but it's written as a novel rather than a film. Although I think they just made it into a film for Netflix, maybe. I haven't watched it, but I picked this book up because I wanted to see how a slasher felt in writing. It's just not a type of book I've ever read before. Now, I've read horror before, but normally it's more like monster horror or psychological horror, or I read a lot of like Stephen King, things like that. And so it's not always just like the horror that is humanity, but that's what this book is about. And it's very reminiscent of some of the old 90s slashers like Scream, you know, but it stood on its own. And it was a little less than 300 pages, and I read it in an evening. And I found that I really enjoyed it. It was really a lot of fun. And it's not that that surprises me. It's just I didn't think the formula would work so well in written word, because a lot of what these films rely on is the graphic violence and showing it to you. And that's typically what gets people's most visceral reactions. When you see somebody attacked in one of these movies, if that's something that you're not comfortable seeing, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable. And I was like, horror movies and horror video games, things like that don't really scare me too much. I consume a lot of horror media, but I don't really get scared by it, if that makes sense. And so one of the things I've done for most of my life is I've looked for films that scare me, and I still haven't found one. Um, And so recently I've started reading more horror books, especially with the season change, and I find that that tends to creep me out a lot more. So this book is about this young woman who has like a past that we don't really know too much about at the beginning of it. She's, I think, 17 years old in a new high school. She's been there for a little while, and she has like this small group of friends. And as it starts off, we follow somebody completely separately, and I'm thinking, okay, here's our main character, and we follow her for a chapter, and the next chapter it just says, and she was murdered last night. Now we don't get to see that kill on screen. On screen, we don't get to see that kill on the page, but then it cuts to our main character, and almost every kill after that, I believe, is on the page, and it's not gone over in too much detail. It's not overly gross, um, but it's effective. And as I'm reading this, I found that I really, really liked the style of the slasher movie in novel format. And so, if any of you guys have other recommendations for good horror books, please let me know. Um, and if you're looking for one, you can check out There's Someone Inside Your House. I would say that it's definitely worth reading. And then back to, other horror books that I've read that I've gotten good like reactions from. I remember it was maybe 3 years ago. I was riding my motorcycle into my job, and I worked overnights at the time, so it was probably around 11 p.m. I had my uh, speakers set up in my helmet, and so I'm listening to an audiobook while I ride to work. And the book that I'm listening to at that time was Stephen King's Salem's Lot. And I remember riding this motorcycle down these dark wooded roads thinking, man, something is going to come out and get me. And that was really such a different experience from a novel. And I'd say that probably the most horrifying novel that I've ever read was King's Pet Sematary, and for completely different reasons. When you look into things like Salem's Lot, it's about a monster, you know what I mean? Salem's Lot is about vampires. And so you have a tangible thing that's scary, and you get to see it wreak havoc on, that town. But when you read something horrific in the vein of Pet Cemetery, yeah, King adds some supernatural horror there because that's what he does. But the real horror in that book is just the grief that this family goes through. And if you haven't read the book, I won't spoil it for you, but it is the most brutal and accurate depiction of human grief that I have ever read. And it's a book that I found myself unable to reread, especially after experiencing loss in my own life. And he just captured that feeling so well. And that is the most horrifying novel I've ever read. Um, and I mean, I've read a lot of his other horror books too. Like I've read It, and I don't really find that book particularly frightening, but I thought it was a really interesting story, barring some scenes that don't seem necessary. Um, but I read a lot of King. I think that my favorite King book though was a recent release that he did, and it was like a mixture of fairy tales and horror, and it was called Fairy Tale. And that one's about like a young man who starts taking care of an older gentleman and learns that this older gentleman has a portal to another world, a fairy tale world on his property, and he sort of ventures down in there to try and save his dog. And that was really fun. That was a phenomenal read. And so I find myself continuing to come back to fiction when I'm looking for something to occupy my time. And so I guess really what this video is about. If you guys have any recommendations for novels, now mind you, I read more than horror. I also read science fiction and fantasy. I'll read romance. If it keeps my interest, I'll read thrillers. I'll read almost anything. The only rule is that it has to be able to keep my attention. If it's like a really, really boring or overly pretentious book, I probably won't finish it. I subscribe to the same idea as King, that life is too short for bad books. Um, but if any of you guys have book recommendations, I would really, really appreciate it if you drop them below, especially books that might be good for the upcoming fall season leading into Halloween. And with that, I'm going to wish you all happy piping and sign off. I'm going to go wake my wife up and we're going to make dinner. Happy piping.